Sarah Hardesty. I work with Art League in various capacities as a part-time gallery manager and working with exhibitions, and it's been a pleasure to see this exhibition unfold. Dan Borden, one of our board members and exhibition committee member, has kind of been working on this theme for a while, and Conor and Christina have done an amazing job during the exhibition, and the work that is included has been very well received. Art League is in a building with many artists and other businesses, so it's had a lot of views. So welcome, everyone. I'll be introducing the jurors and getting us started. So a little bit about Art League. Art League Rhode Island offers a community of support and inspiration to all visual artists, empowering them with resources to realize their full creative potential. Our goal is for members' work to be recognized not only locally, but also on an international scale. So as you might know, we have members, we have different levels of members, we have artist members, we have elected artist members. We do a lot for the members, but then also we work with national and international artists. We also work with artists in our building, and we offer exhibitions for students, and we have a high school program, exhibition program that we do every year in some iteration. So we're a lot about community and coming together and really just uplifting each other and supporting our work, others' work, and getting the work out there. And so community and communicating. So our wonderful jurors, first I'll introduce Christina Alderman. She's the Director of Family and Teen Programs at the RISD Museum, where she develops and oversees educational initiatives that foster creative engagement for young audiences. Her work focuses on making art accessible through interactive experiences, interdisciplinary learning, and community collaborations. All wonderful, wonderful things. Recent projects include Listen from 24 and 25, co-curated with Conor Moynihan, and RISD Art Circle, as well as collaborations with local youth organizations and artists. She is dedicated to creating spaces where teens and families can explore, interpret, and connect with art in meaningful ways. Welcome, Christina. Conor Moynihan is the Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the RISD Museum, where he focuses on the modern and contemporary work in the collection. His areas of focus include performance, identity-based practices, queer art, and disability arts. His recent exhibitions at the RISD Museum include Variants, Making, Unmaking, and Remaking Disability from 22, The Performative Self-Portrait from 23, and with Christina Alderman and members of RISD Art Circle, Listen, which you just mentioned. He is currently working on an exhibition surveying documents tabletop still lifes for fall 2027. So we look forward to that. And I just want to say that it's been an honor seeing their process. They have put a lot of time and dedication and thought into creating this exhibition. They had a hand in installing and laying out the show and just put a lot of thought. So it's been an honor to see that and to see your process. So thank you both for all of your time and energy, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. I'm Conor Moynihan. It's a pleasure to connect with you all tonight. Christina and I thought that first we would just talk a bit about how we approach the Truth Unveiled, this exhibition, a bit about our process, how we work together, and then walk through some of our choices and really how we understood the show by working with all the work that you submitted and coming to this final result. So Christina, I don't know if you want to say anything right away. No, okay. Well, I'll just
thank you, Conor. Yes.
I'll just start by saying, so this was, these types of exhibitions, putting these types of shows together is always really interesting because, as Sarah mentioned, Dan was the one who put a lot of thought into this, and we were given this concept of Truth Unveiled and a version of the statement that you see here. And then they invited Christina and I to come in. So we have two groups of people that are really thinking on this concept. And then, of course, everyone, it was an open call. So all the artists submitted the work based off how they understood this and how they understood that work fitting into this. And so it became this really interesting conversation between how each of us were all thinking about this concept and what came through with that. And, I think Christine and I both, our process was really focused on, like what work looked like what was being submitted and how is it, being interpreted by the artist's voice? Like what was the statement? What was the concept behind it? We really leaned in heavily to that part of the application process. We really went, we were drawn in by what we saw visually, but we read every statement. We really went through that really thoroughly, and it really helped us understand sometimes like, oh yes, we're seeing what the artist intended. And sometimes we're like, oh, I was saying one thing and we're reading this statement, I'm seeing it in a whole different way. And that really informed our process going through, putting this together and thinking about this. I don't have the exact number, but I believe we were approaching 200 submissions. So it was a huge amount of work to sift through. And it was really a great pleasure. And I want to thank everyone who submitted, because there's so much vulnerability in that and sharing your work with other people. And we really appreciated the opportunity to spend time with it. Idea of where I'm going with the thematic show at the beginning. And it really changes as I go through it and as I learned. And I think I have the call up here so we can all remember what the words were of the statement that people submitted to, because I certainly had a point of view when I started, and that point of view very much changed as I looked at the different ways that each of you responded and came to this work. And I think that was something that was really important for Christina and I when we made selections, is that we wanted to, not just have our idea and not just the idea that we knew that came from Art League, but also how did everyone respond to this? What were the themes that were coming out in the work that was submitted? And we wanted to make sure that we honored that in different ways. And then just sort of if you've been to the show, you'll see, and as Sarah alluded to, Christina and I would, we had to have some way of making stories to sort of fit the work in. So there are 7 sections within the show. And then tonight we're going to go through those 7 sections, talk about how we were understanding the concept of the show through the work that was submitted, and unpack that a bit with a few examples from the show, just so that you all can understand at least how we were approaching it. And then we'll look forward to questions at the end. Christina, anything that you want to say now?
You summed up beautifully, Conor. We can get into it.
Okay. Well, so we'll jump right in. So we had 7 categories. So the first category, which I'll start talking about, which is a broad category of what's true and what's truth. And this was a really sort of fun revelation for me as I was working on this show, is there were so many works that really responded to truth as this sort of core concept, or this objective truth, or this call to action. There's a lot of works that really made me think about what is truth? And I thought it was a good way to start there of if we're going to deal with a show about truth, we really should have some good sense of what truth means. What are we really thinking about? And so thinking about the works that really pushed the boundaries there and really made us think in different ways there. And then we'll have throughout today some installation shots, especially as I know many people maybe haven't seen the show, and I hope they will come see it, just so you get a sense of how things are laid out. So this was in one of the main corridors of the building. And then these are just 2 examples that are from this section that, really had us thinking about truth. So the work on the left is by Scott Chandler. There's actually 2 photographs from this series that are coming from Scott that are on view. And what I loved about these is we look at these photographs, and maybe if you haven't seen them in time, what I was struck when I saw these, I was like, oh, look at these photographs from outer space or from NASA. What is the concept behind these works exactly? And when I read the statement, what I realized that Scott had led me to think, which was exactly his goal, was that we were looking at ordinary stones that had been using different dramatizations of light and perspective, or passing off as something else, and the way that technology really shapes the way that we view the world. And I thought that was really effective, and really had me I looked at one thing thinking this is a beautiful photograph, and sort of pivoting around and thinking about it from a different way entirely. And then the work on the right, this is by Elise Racine. And apologies to everyone in the room if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please correct me afterwards, and apologies in advance. But Elise's work, again, there's a photo base to it, but she's also using technology. She's using through when we're looking at something, and then sort of questioning, for Elise's work, thinking about the power structures, the technological structures, the digital resource structures that underpin the world around us, these sort of governing powers that maybe we don't take for granted. So again, these are like, what is true? What is really sort of at the basis of our truth when we're thinking about these words? So these were two works that I thought were productive to think about that. I'm going to pass off to Christina now.
Sure. So calling it out. So this is a section that really sort of began early on because I think many people, when this call was initially announced, initially as an idea, there was a lot of thoughts about how politically motivated or politically charged that this exhibition could actually turn out to be. And as we looked at the submissions, it wasn't that there wasn't things that were politically minded. There wasn't things commenting on the presidency, our current, issues around migration and immigration. There were those things. What was the struggle was that it felt like a very monotone series, very fast. Like, we know these struggles happen, and we know that there's many political issues going on with elected officials. And it was hard to distinguish what truth was there other than just sort of stating the reality that we're living in. And so we began to think about, how do we dig into what truth means in the myriads of truths that can be unveiled and can be revealed to us through these times. But there's still political nature to that. So we were looking at these works as artworks that were looking at things that were systemic, more endemic problems with our culture and our society, but doing it in a way that maybe asked us more questions than had a direct commentary or gave us answer. In the works on the left that we're looking at, we're talking about environment, we're talking about identity, and we're talking about medicine, all in that row, as well as larger politics. And then on the right is an artwork that's about travel and a photo collage that you may or may not know where the scenes are from and be able to readily recognize them. But we know that, tourism is causing many problems in many countries. We know Americans are not welcome in many countries because of their tourism and the way it's over-tourist. So we were sort of saying, that seemed more of an issue that we could talk about, but in a way that was complex and acknowledged complexity and asked you to look a little bit longer, and while poster making has a long tradition in Providence, and we have a large printmaking community of printmaking posters, and it felt like some of these objects could go in multiple categories, but the reason because this is about environment, this one that says, are the woods really going silent? Talking about that environment, but in terms of what it's actually doing for us, is it's calling attention to something political in a way that makes us ask, again, more questions in thinking about it. And on the bottom it says, or am I going deaf? And is the question of the trees or you, these sort of entanglements were what we were looking at in this section of calling it out. So to be political, but not overly political. Oh, there was two more. That's right. The close-up, of the photograph, but also this one of the Rockwell reference of, the traditional dinner. But the question is Uncle Sam putting it on the table? Is he taking it away? Is there shock? What are we going through? This was the one that felt like it was looking at something that was very, it's hard to also not read this now with our government shutdown, and I'm thinking about food scarcity in many of our communities and sort of what this says to that. So I think, again, this one's talking about politics, but in a way that feels a little bit more complex.
And so, and as Christina mentioned, one thing you'll hear is that these are not hard and fixed categories. These are categories that have really porous borders as we were working on them. But, one thing that we wanted to acknowledge, there was a lot of work that was really responding directly to the environment and environmental concerns and how the reality that we need to face up, especially with, climate disaster, and climate change that is happening all around us. A lot of works were responding to this, so it felt important to have a section that did that, but there was a lot of nuance with the way that each of you responded to this. There was some really thinking about the environment, and some thinking about personal relationships to the landscape, some thinking about cultural landscapes, really thinking about the environment and the environmental realities. So this was also within the gallery space. You can see a range of work from painting to weaving to the sculpture that occupied this space. And again, just for me, I like to just kind of highlight two to really sort of think about some of the themes that were happening here. So on the left is a work by Gail Gilbert. It's a little hard to appreciate on the screen, but it's a sculptural work that is hanging on the wall. And Gail starts with photography, then works with encaustic and molds it into a sculpture. And in this case, we have like a sculpture of a dryad, something that's coming from Greek mythology, these sort of spirits that are connected to the landscape and specifically to trees. And she is formed out of a photograph of a tree. And what Gail is getting to with the statement is really thinking about the ways that implicated or intertwined with the natural landscape, in particular with trees and with waterways and rivers, and this sort of anthropomorphization of the tree in the form of the dryad really felt like it spoke to that, and it spoke to that in ways that were really personal, right? These sort of personal relationships that we have with nature, and the truth that's being unveiled there is, of course, like this like the way that we often neglect nature, or maybe not we always do, but the way that nature is something that is deeply important to all of our day-to-day lives, but it's something that maybe isn't always top of mind, and that is something that we're deeply connected to. And similarly, but in a very different mode, in a painting with different materials that is brought to it, Aaron Starr is also thinking about the climate, but more forcibly thinking about climate disaster and climate change and things that are happening in the world through these abstract paintings that are meant to be like vast topographies of Earth from a human perspective necessarily, but something like you're sort of zooming out and seeing it from far above, and that like the impact that humans are having on the environment in a very negative way. So on one hand, we have Gail sort of reminding us of like the importance of being connected, and Aaron sort of highlighting these ongoing devastations that are happening at a much larger scale than us that we need to zoom out and pay attention to. So both are reminders, sort of these calling of the truth of the natural world and how we need to be better stewards of the environment, not just for us, but just with the world as a whole.
So this is our section that was looking at truth in sort of slightly more subjective terms, because in ways we all have our own lived truths and our own understanding. And I think one of the interesting things about where Conor and I work in academia, sort of what is one hold like an argument or a space where they can say what they need to say, and that statement can be seen as fact. But you can't deny what somebody feels and what somebody sees and the way one lives, and that truth exists unto themselves. And so as we were looking through these things, there were these larger conversations that people were having about ideas that exist in society, but then there was conversations that people were having about themselves and the world that they experienced and the way they see it, but also what they see in others. So if you want to jump to the installation shot, Conor, you can see it's in this hallway. When you first walk in, you see these works there, and they're a mixture of small scale and intimate works, large scale works, and then two works to focus on, Conor, if you want to go to those. Looking at a bit at the contrast of these. So, Lynn Walsh, this work that's just very much about seeing a person and who this person really is, and showing the truth that exists within being yourself and feeling confident and comfortable with the way you see yourself and seeing someone for who they really are. Sometimes in our society, I think in the state of media and everything, we have a hard time finding ourselves and feeling confident and seeing who we are. And I think Lynn did a beautiful job of rendering this person to feel like a very tender, honest, open, ready person. And then on the other side, you have Jonathan's work, which is really more about like how one memorializes time and thinks about their experience and the way that that becomes a personal narrative of a personal place, of a personal experience, but it's how they remember it and how they know what happened, and that will live embodied in them forever, who they are. So I think it complicates notions of what truth means and asks us to be more empathetic and understand that truth is something that exists within all of us in ways.
And then, as we were working, there was a lot of works that really responded in a very direct way visually to the call, like the Truth Unveiled, and the works that were really responding to veiling and unveiling. And some of there was a wide range of why those works were using those different motifs. But we really wanted to recognize that, and we paired it then with, veiled and unveiled as one section, but within that is also shadows. Shadows was a theme that was happening throughout a lot of the work. And so how we were thinking about them is, truth is something that it can be something that is revealed or something that is concealed and not seen. And shadows plays into that as well, right? Light and dark is a metaphor that we play with, right? Where light is where the knowledge is and darkness is maybe where something is hidden. And just sort of, where artists were in these sections were really playing with those visual metaphors and really working with them. So this is, where they're sort of situated. They are facing, if you went into the gallery space for Art League and then stepped out, these would be on the walls that are sort of right there as you're going there. So there's work like you see on the left where you have these two figures that are in a landscape and you have the shadows that they're projecting onto the landscape. And then we were using the word veil really broadly. Anytime we saw these sort of gauzy type appearances in work, we were really thinking about that as a motif that was being executed and sort of playing into the title of the work. But one thing, like I said, like whenever I'm doing an exhibition, I'm really also very much learning from the artists I'm working with. And Diana Vosper, who you see here on the left, along with other artists, many pointed out to me, which I did not know this, the definition of apocalypse. The historic definition of apocalypse means like a revelation. And so many of you knew that, and I didn't, and it was really made me see the veils in different ways. And really think that I think at Diana's work is at a much more cosmic and sort of galaxial level. A lot of her work is thinking about the emergence of everything and with that is truth. And so I love this sort of very sort of like we're in the universe, this veil that is being torn aside and everything is emerging from it. And, again, thinking about, sort of literalizing this, but putting it at a much more cosmic level. And then Ruth's work, what you see on the right, where you see a figure in silhouette in shadow, sort of cast on the ground on the shore, where you have the water surging against the sand. Ruth's statement really draws this attention to this work being about the environment, thinking about the environment and the world around us. But I think Christina and I really spent time with this one, really thinking about the role of the shadow, which I believe is Ruth's shadow in this work. And like, what does that say about this work? Like, what is the shadow doing in this work? And to me, it felt about introspection. It also was like projecting oneself into the landscape, the role that we have as we project into space. And really like what work the shadow does. And like, again, think about what a shadow can mean of like darkness and the unknown, but also like that's where we contain our truths and that's where truths, manifest and as they sort of emerge into this world. So this work really performed that in this really elegant way. And if you think about this pairing, right, we have the cosmic and the very individual, the way that truth and veils are operative in both of those scales.
And then there was a lot of work that was dealing with personal narratives and personal stories in relationship. What was really great for Conor and I is I think the complexity and the amount of different aspects there were around looking at gender and looking at identity in the works of art. In sort of some of them were more traditional, some of them were ones that people would consider less traditional. There were ones that were more ambiguous, but I think the reason it clung to us for the truth is because we as a culture right now are seeing gender as something that needs to be fixed and something that needs to be true in a singular way rather than true in a plurality of ways in how gender can be one's truth, and it doesn't have to be something that's defined by anybody other than self, and we as a society can accept that as a truth. And so if you go to the installation shots, there's on a broad wall. Many of the works were photograph related within this one. Who works Conor. On one side, we have this work by Barry Johnson that is Barbie legs and a crucifix. And sort of looking at this idea of many of us have had crucifixes in our lives and seen them around. And, there is this feminization of this figure, but yet we are not accepting that as a culture and don't want that as a culture in sort of how we're defining what male and masculinity means. if, Christ as male figure. So this sort of played with that complexity in a way that was really, I thought, delicate and tender. And I think we sort of were drawn to it for that. It was dealing with something that is quite complex and quite potentially controversial to some people, but in a way that felt soft enough to ask questions about. And then on the other side of Susan Borowitz's work, there was a couple in this series that we selected, really looking at female figures and their roles in society, and sort of this one thinking about how, this figure is alone and clinging to a tree above water, and the figure is a woman in later middle age, and sort of thinking about when gender identity becomes less important to people as they age and what one does, and that's relationship to reproductivity and how one views what female is and how one defines. And so I think this work gave us a lot of interesting questions to think about, as well as just was actually quite playful and funny in how it was trying to take on what we thought was potentially complex topic. And so, so we went with those for that reason.
And then the last section that we'll talk about before we get into the awards and then into a Q&A after that is Truth Beyond Knowing. This is the smallest section in the show. But one thing I think Christina and I both wanted to honor and recognize is that while we were thinking about truth, there was work that suggested this idea of truth that's beyond something that can be attained through like traditional forms of knowledge making, right? That there are those types of truths that maybe we hold in our bodies, that may be connected to spirituality, that might be connected to faith-based traditions that we subscribe to. And that was, something that we thought was like a valid way to think about truth, and something that I didn't come in thinking about it as I was doing this show. And, we wanted to include that and sort of center it in its own section. But the work on the left is by John Anderson, and this is coming from a series where he's making portraits of figures who are experiencing religious spirituality. In particular, Anderson is responding to his Christian faith, creating these portraits of people who are feeling that and sort of having that sense of spiritual knowing that comes from, again, not necessarily facts in the world, but something that is more connected to one's relationship to their faith. And, while Anderson is responding to Christian faith, it really, I think, speaks to the way that faith plays a role in truth for ourselves. And then sort of opposite to that, we have two works from Beatty Barbaros, and in his series, his work, he describes it as really sort of confronting the viewer, pushing boundaries, thinking about things in different ways. So I was really struck with this image where you have this woman and these ropes are sort of falling off of her, or she's letting them go and she's starting to levitate. Thinking about, I think, trusting the truth of ourselves, like what do we have inside of us, like what do we know is true that maybe we feel is true but we don't always let to be true, or maybe we're not able to access it for X, Y, and Z, but like when we really sort of tap into it, the sort of magical power that can come from it, of sort of being in oneself and reveling in that sort of self-truth, that's again sort of a truth that is beyond knowing, that it's sort of through being. So those are the 7 sections. These slides got mixed up. This is where they are in the gallery. They're near the gender truth as well, where Christina just spoke about. And a range of abstract work and figurative work, drawings, photography. That was important as we went through the show. There was so many different mediums that were submitted, and we wanted to make sure that we recognize all of those different types of media that were submitted. But now I'm going to transition to the awards. So Christina and I are going to talk about the awards that we made. And this was, I think, the hardest part of doing the show. One thing is selecting the work, and another was really like, how do we talk about that process? But it was so challenging that we decided to do 2 honorable mentions in addition to the 3 awards that we'll talk about at the end. And before I show who the honorable mentions are, I just want to say one reason that we picked them is for Christina and I both, they really sort of pushed the boundary of what we were thinking about was fitting within the show. They really made us think about things in interesting ways. And, any work that makes me think about truth differently, especially after you're looking through 200, it was really meaningful, and we really wanted to make sure that we recognize those. So the first one is this work by Saracen Hale. And I know Christina had this thought, and I had the same thought when we were clicking through this. The work's called Paper Towel, and you see this, and I was like, okay, we need a little bit more than pinning paper towels into the wall to have some truth here. But the more time I spent with it, this is what is happening here. So Saracen carved a wood block to look very convincingly like the pattern in paper towel, and beautifully embossed that paper. So this is in our section of what's true, what's truth. It really thinking about, like, again, how convinced we can be through the materiality of something to think that it is true. But there also is this celebration of the ordinary, and I think truth can be ordinary and very domestic, and I think that's something that this work is doing. So I hope you go see it in person. It is really like magical to spend time with, and just sort of the subtlety of that, the way that the paper was printed and embossed. And then the other honorable mention was this work by Shelby Scattergood, which is in the Calling It Out section. So what I loved about this work is, like, when you see it, I saw it when it was being concealed, the light part is concealed, there's multiple perspectives that are here. And that was exactly what Shelby was trying to get to. So Shelby was speaking through her experience as someone with autism and navigating the world, and the world is really designed for neurotypical people and very certain types of people, and people who fall into that category get to take for granted the way that the world has been designed for them. And this work really reveals the way that the world isn't designed for everyone, and that there's different ways of being in the world. And this work sort of makes you think about that. Like, again, it sort of made me perform that sense of, how am I supposed to engage with this work? How am I supposed to look at it? It makes you move around, to look through, look at the sides, look up, above and below. And I just love the way that, I didn't know what the work was about. But as I read this statement, I realized it was making me perform how the artist intended me to perform. And so I thought that was really meaningful, and wanted to include it as an honorable mention. So now we're going to move to the three awards, third, second, and first. And Christina's going to go first.
Yeah. So this work by Kyle Chaput is really, they're an artist based in Texas, and thinking about the border wall and the people crossing and the lives spent and the lives lost in that journey, but also as an individual with Crohn's disease, and looking at their internal struggles, and how there's a relationship between the way the world struggles for existence and how one has to change, and how one has to adapt to function in the larger world and in these larger systems, as well as how one has to deal with their own body and reconcile themselves, right? I think similarly to Shelby, we're also talking about people who have to navigate in a very different way to understand what truth is and the way that they live. And there's this, in this work that's a mixture of print techniques, is really, it was a lot of intricacy, and I do a lot of zooming in really closely to see the level of detail and to see the work going on. It's hard to understand the multiple layers and complexity in the Zoom format, but also thinking about the ways there's this metaphor of the ship, in the sinking ship, and sort of what that means also in both the river that straddles the border for part of the way, but also in sort of life as a metaphor of the sinking ship. So I think this one, while a small piece and somewhat opaque in its meaning, it was one we kept coming back to and thinking about continually, because it was navigating so many narratives and understandings of how one operates in the world and the systems that they navigate within. So we were really just appreciated it for that, for making us ask, again, many questions about it more than answers. And then in second place, we have Lisa Devin's Three Little Nutria, which this work, while Lisa's really thinking a lot about environment and environmental impact in her statement, she was talking a lot about the work in nutria being an invasive species that are considered labeled as an invasive species or a non-native species to America, being rodents, being pest controlled. sort of in this see no evil, hear no evil, think no evil format, it really becomes more to us and Conor about understanding and non-human understanding. So looking at truth through the lens of non-human relationship. And so we felt like this was a really great piece at asking questions of what's truth for us as humans and how we navigate might not be truth for all creatures, and sort of even like the crocodile's function in this, and sort of how nature has to exist and create its own existence within the human environments that we have constructed. This piece is predominantly colored pencil, and it's very large scale. So there was also sort of a large, when we saw it in person, it had a moment where we're sort of trying to like take it in because it's a lot to take in. So I think that really bumped it up for us in to why it received the second prize.
And then the first place prize we are awarding to Mark Holy, Allegory of Denial. This was a work that, visually was really striking when we saw it, both on the screen when we were doing the application, and then when it came in person. There was a rich amount of detail. There was a lot of things happening in the work itself that kept moving my eye around. But I think one might question, like, why does a work titled Allegory of Denial end up as first place in Truth Unveiled? And like I said, as I really learned through this process, really thinking about what truth is, I think denial is, you have to have a sense of truth to deny. And so there is this sense of playing with like this truth that's about to emerge, or this ways that we know that truth is out there, or something is true that we actively work against, or we come up with tools and apparatuses for us to think differently, but really truth is this sort of like core pin that is governing all of those actions, whether you want to lean into them or lean out of them. And so this work, I think, really made me think about that in really interesting ways. I know Christina and I had a wonderful time spending in front of it, and we're thinking not just concept, but also the making of the work itself. And we really felt like this one rose to the top for us, and we wanted to honor it as the first place. And we spent a lot of time talking, so I think it's now time to turn it over to everyone else for the Q&A.
I've been unmuted.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Mark.
Going through the exhibit live and in person, I was just like, it was an amazing amount of interpretations that people have done to the theme of the exhibit, or the theme of the call. I was just I couldn't figure it out how it fit, how many of these things actually jived into the works. But I want to thank you both for kind of expanding my understanding, how to look at an artwork, how to another way to apply the question of what's going on here, and so that it can then turn itself into an understanding of how you judge the work, and how the work were selected, and maybe a little bit of the insight of how the artists themselves worked on it. I think you did a great job of selecting, and also the arrangements of the work on the walls was very, very well done. So congratulations. It's not an easy task. So thank you. And thank you for the award, by the way. The thing, I want to say one thing about allegory is that we're going through a political times of what the truth is. And it's been distorted all over the place. So I analyzed where truth is. Where would be something that would be exactly, unequivocally true. No ambiguities, no different opinions. And I had, it was hard to find the thing that would fit that, except for I had this plumb line that was used in building projects that I was involved with. And the plumb line is an absolute truth. It suspends from a string to a weight to the center of the earth. There's no denying that, unless you want to deliberately deny it yourself. So you've got to distort what you know is truth. And that I thought, this is a good way to do it. This is a good way to show what's going on in our society now, without calling the attention to any particular party or anywhere there would be ambiguity about truth. So that's I also wanted to do a self-portrait, and I really didn't want to put my face in the self-portrait. So putting my back of my hand really worked well.
That's great.
So thank you, folks, again.
Yeah. Yeah, the plumb line was awesome.
I have the plumb line. It's it's an awesome tool. It's probably been a tool since the beginning of building. I had a couple of builders building a brick column for me one time, and I said, no, I don't want it dead straight. I want it to have some flexibility to it. I don't want it to look like it came out of a machine. It's an interesting tool itself. There's also I put in Birkenstocks. I was wearing Birkenstocks. I made them green and blue, kind of like in honor of the earth, that kind of thing. And then threw in a bunch of stuff that was just kind of like free form with my imagination. I think that's one of the nice things we can do with art, is just put in whatever our heart tells us to do. That's one of the pleasures of being an artist, is that we get a chance to be creators. That's enough for me.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate you submitting the work and hearing your words on it. It's great.